Number 3. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We were all excited for a weekend away from the city, immersed in nature, with no distractions. We picked a remote spot deep in the forest, a place we had never been before but had heard was perfect for camping. The first night was perfect. We sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling jokes. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly what we needed. But as night fell, something shifted. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen. We shrugged it off as the usual nighttime chill. We turned in for the night, each of us retreating to our tents. I woke up around midnight, shivering. I'd left my sleeping bag partially unzipped. I reached out to close it, and that's when I heard it. A faint whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but the whispers grew clearer. They sounded like voices, people speaking in urgent, hushed tones. I sat up, straining to listen, but the voices faded away. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I closed my eyes, hoping to drift back to sleep, but the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to come from all directions, as if the trees themselves were whispering secrets. I could make out a few words. Help us. And don't leave. I peeked outside my tent, but all I could see were the shadows of trees swaying in the moonlight. I called out to my friends, but no one answered. A knot of unease twisted in my stomach. I decided to step out and check on them. As I walked towards the campfire, the whispers grew frantic. They're coming, they seemed to say. I reached the fire pit, but my friends were nowhere in sight. Their tents were empty, and their belongings were scattered. Panic set in. I ran through the campsite, calling their names, but only whispers responded, growing louder and more desperate. Don't go, they said. Stay with us. I stumbled through the forest, trying to find my friends, but it felt like the trees were closing in on me. The whispers turned into mournful wails. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the whispers were not just in my head. They were coming from the trees. Just as I was about to break down, I saw a faint light in the distance. I hurried towards it, hoping it was my friends. As I approached, the light grew dimmer, and the whispers grew louder, more distant. I could barely make out shapes moving in the darkness. They were twisted and contorted. Then, I saw them, my friends standing motionless in the clearing. Their eyes were wide open, but they didn't seem to see me. They just stood there, as if waiting for something. The whispers surrounded them, growing louder and more chaotic. I wanted to scream, but I was rooted to the spot. The trees around me seemed to reach out with gnarled branches, and the air was thick with a sense of dread. I could feel something dark and malevolent watching me from the shadows. Suddenly, my friends' eyes turned towards me, but their expressions were blank, almost lifeless. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I turned back to the clearing, but it was empty. My friends were gone. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving only the sound of the wind. I stumbled back to the campsite, my heart racing. I packed up as quickly as I could and left the forest behind. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I tried to tell others, but no one believes me. All I know is that something in those woods didn't want us there. Something that used the whispers of the trees to lure us in. I never went camping again, and every time I hear a whisper in the wind, I can't help but shiver, remembering the night the trees spoke to me. Number 2. Camping alone in the woods had always been my way to unwind, so when I found a secluded spot near a crystal clear lake, I was thrilled. It was just me, the tranquil surroundings, and the promise of a few days of solitude. The first evening went as planned. I set up my tent, started a campfire, and cooked a simple dinner. The forest was serene. I felt a deep sense of peace as the sun dipped down below the horizon. Night fell, and I crawled into my tent, ready for a good night's sleep. But sleep was elusive. An uneasy feeling settled over me. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and tried to relax. Around 2 a.m., I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from outside. I assumed it was a branch tapping against the tent and dismissed it. But as the tapping grew louder, I grew more unsettled. I unzipped the tent slightly and peered outside. The woods were pitch black, the only light coming from the dying embers of my campfire. I saw nothing but shadows and the faint outline of trees. I lay back down, telling myself it was just my imagination. The tapping continued, more insistent this time. I checked my surroundings again, this time with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the campsite. Everything seemed in order, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The tapping had stopped. I shined my light around the area, but all I could see were the trees and the lake. I was about to head back to my tent when I noticed something strange. A series of small, shallow footprints in the mud leading away from the campsite. The footprints were too small to be from an animal, and they seemed to be moving in circles around my tent. I followed them, my heart pounding. The trail led me to the edge of the lake, where the water was eerily still. I shone my flashlight across the surface, but saw nothing unusual. Just as I turned to head back, I heard a soft splash behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I started to feel the fear creep in. I decided to head back to my tent and pack up. This was not how I had planned my trip. When I got back to the campsite, I noticed the fire had gone out completely. I was about to start a new fire when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The shallow footprints I had seen before were now around my tent, and they were moving inward, toward where I had left my gear. A sudden gust of wind blew through the trees, making the tent flap wildly. I darted inside, grabbed my things, and prepared to leave. But as I turned to zip up the tent, I noticed something chilling. The footprints leading to my tent were no longer there. Instead, there were now deep imprints of hands pressed into the ground around my sleeping bag. I stumbled back in horror, my flashlight beam flickering. I grabbed my backpack and bolted towards the car, not daring to look back. I drove out the woods as fast as I could. My mind was racing. When I got home, I noticed something strange. My phone, which I had left in the car the entire time, had a series of missed calls from an unknown number. I checked the voicemail and my heart nearly stopped. The voice on the recording was calm and eerily familiar. It was my own voice, repeating over and over, "You're not alone. We're watching." I never went camping alone again. The strange presence in the wood and the unsettling voicemail left me with more questions than answers. To this day, I can't explain who or what was watching me that night, or how they managed to use my own voice to haunt me. Number 1. My brother and I, for the sake of the story, let's call him Jake, had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. We were two adventurous souls craving a break from our daily grind. We chose a remote spot by a secluded lake, far from the usual crowds. The idea was simple: just us, the forest, and a weekend of relaxation. We arrived early Friday afternoon, set up our tent, and started a fire. The lake was serene, and the forest was lush and silent. We spent the evening fishing, laughing, and sharing old stories around the campfire. As the sun set, we went to bed, excited for the days ahead. But that night, sleep came slowly. I kept hearing strange noises, faint rustling and occasional whispers that seemed to drift on the wind. I told myself it was just the forest settling down for the night. Jake, always the sound sleeper, didn't seem to notice. Around midnight, I woke up to a loud thud. I nudged Jake, but he just mumbled and turned over. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the campsite, and everything seemed still. I found nothing out of place, so I returned to bed, dismissing it as a fallen branch or a deer. The next morning, Jake and I went for a hike. We explored trails and enjoyed the natural beauty. When we returned to camp, I noticed something odd. The fire pit was cold, though we left the embers burning. It felt as if someone had been there after we left, tampering with our things. Jake shrugged it off, suggesting it was probably just the wind. We spent the evening fishing again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As dusk fell, the eerie feeling grew stronger. The forest seemed to hold its breath. That night, as we sat by the fire, the whispers started again. This time, they were more distinct, soft, pleading voices. I tried to ignore them, but the unease grew unbearable. I suggested we head to bed early, hoping a good night's rest would put our nerves at ease. When I crawled into the tent, I felt a cold breeze sweep through. I zipped up the tent and tried to sleep, but the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from outside, getting closer. I woke Jake again, and this time he was more alert. We listened intently, but the noises had stopped. The next morning, Jake and I found our campsite in disarray. Our fishing gear was scattered, and our food supplies were missing. It was as if someone, or something, had rifled through our belongings. We were baffled, but decided to pack up and head home early. The forest had taken an unsettling quality, and we both felt a strange urge to leave. As we were packing, I noticed something chilling. Our footprints around the campsite were not just ours. There were smaller, unfamiliar prints leading away from our tent and towards the woods. They were oddly shaped, almost claw-like, and seemed to end abruptly, as if the owner of the footprints had vanished into thin air. Jake and I finished packing quickly and hurried to the car. We were about to drive away when Jake stopped abruptly. His face turned pale as he pointed at the car's back seat. I turned to see what had caught his attention. There, on the seat, was an old, weathered journal. It wasn't ours. Curious and apprehensive, I opened it. The pages were filled with frantic writings and drawings. The entries spoke of being watched by them, of disappearing at night, and of a never-ending cycle of terror. The final entry was scrawled in frantic letters. They're here. They come for us in the dark. We never leave. We become them. My blood ran cold. We realized, with growing horror, that the journal was a record of previous campers who had vanished from this very spot. It seemed we had unknowingly followed the same pattern. We drove away, leaving the forest behind, but as we glanced back, we saw shadows moving among the trees, dark figures that seemed to follow us, even from a distance. The forest had a way of claiming those who ventured too close to its secrets. To this day, Jake and I never camp alone, and we never speak of that weekend. The forest was more than just a collection of trees. It was a place where the past and present blurred, where those who vanished continued to haunt the woods. We were lucky to escape, but the whispers still follow us in our nightmares, a reminder of what lurks just beyond the trees.